I'm Tisha Bader. Welcome to our series Durban Revisited on JBS, held in partnership with B'nai B'rith International, to discuss the United Nations Conference on Racism that was held in the South African city in 2001 that became a tipping point for antisemitism. We are turning to a number of experts, including those who were at the conference themselves, to share their personal experiences and thoughts as we approach the 20th anniversary of Durban being held at the UN. Here now is CEO of B'nai B'rith International, Dan Mariaschin, with guest Irwin Cotler.
Irwin Cotler is the Canadian government's special envoy to preserve Holocaust remembrance and combat anti-Semitism. He was previously a member of Parliament and Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Professor Irwin Cotler, thank you very much for being here today.
Good meeting with you, Dan.
You were present in Durban, South Africa for the 2001 World Conference Against Racism. Can you briefly recount for our audience your experiences in 2001, in the run-up to the conference, on the ground in Durban, and in its aftermath?
Yeah, let's just put it this way. When it was first announced in 1997 that there was going to be a World Conference Against Racism in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, I greeted that with a good deal of both anticipation, if not excitement. This was to be the first World Anti-Racism Conference of the 21st century. Indeed, this was to be the first International Human Rights Conference of the 21st century. And it was to take place in Durban, South Africa, the seat of apartheid, and to commemorate the dismantling of apartheid, South Africa as an apartheid state. But what happened at Durban was truly Orwellian, if I can use an oft-abused metaphor. A conference that was to be a world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. A conference that was to be, as I said, the first International Human Rights Conference of the 21st century, singled out one member state and one people, Israel, for selective opprobrium and indictment. And a conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, called for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Those of us who were present at Durban, Dan, for us, Durban has indelibly imprinted itself on our memory and indeed on our being. And you know, what is not always appreciated is what led up to Durban. There were 4 regional conferences on the road to Durban to develop a national action plan or international action plan and declaration at Durban. The last of those 4 regional conferences was held in Tehran. But what is ignored is that Israel, though it was part of the Asian group, was not invited to that conference. No Jewish NGO was allowed to come to that conference. So you already had a kind of apartheid in the very organization of the conference, except it was against Israel and the Jewish people. And that regional conference in Tehran adopted a declaration, which is one of the most scurrilous indictments of Israel and the Jewish people ever to have emerged since the end of the Second World War, with some of the echoes of the 30s. Israel was singled out and condemned as a crime against humanity, as an apartheid state. In other words, all the demonological indictments that we have today with respect to Israel as a colonial settler state, etc., all that found expression already at Durban. The second thing that took place in the run-up to the Durban conference was the NGO gatherings, which there too became at Durban a festival of hate. So 20 years later, we are left with this legacy of hate. But let me just close by saying what happened in the immediate aftermath of Durban. In the immediate aftermath of Durban, the contracting parties of the 1949 Geneva Convention came together for the first time in 52 years to put a state in the docket of the accused. That state was not, that state did not have anything to do with what took place in Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, or the genocide in the Balkans, or the killing field then in Sierra. The only state put in the docket of the accused for the first time in 52 years was the state of Israel. I might add, as part of the legacy of Durban, that the contracting parties have come together 3 times and have only ever put one state in the docket of the accused, and that is Israel. Second thing is, students gathered at the University of Michigan shortly after the Durban conference for the launching of a boycott, divestment, a BDS movement in effect, and a resolution which called for a 2-state solution in the Middle East if Israel was to become a democratic state. Bad enough, was defeated in place of a resolution which called for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. This weeks after Durban at the university campus. The UN Commission on Human Rights met again shortly after Durban, now the UN Council on Human Rights, to single out Israel for being itself a crime against humanity. I can go on, but one can see the legacy of Durban beginning in the immediate aftermath of Durban. And today, 20 years later, we are witnessing an old, new, global, escalating, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism.
Well, I'd like to go back, if I could, to a point that you made about the 2 separate conferences that were held at the same time in Durban. You went to Durban not as a participant in the NGO forum, but as a delegate of the Canadian government to the official UN member state conference, which ended up adopting the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, as it was called. We know that anti-Semitism manifested itself in both settings, but how, in your assessment, was what happened at the NGO forum and the main conference where the member states were seated different in any way?
Well, the NGO conference, one would have hoped and expected that from the NGO community, given what was happening at that time in the international community, there would have been a condemnation of those dynamics, as I mentioned. But in fact, the NGO forum served as a catalyst for the promotion of those dynamics. I was a member of the Canadian delegation, as you mentioned, but I also participated in the NGO forum. And that NGO forum was, in a word, a festival of hate. And I can still hear the chanting, the marches in the streets, which incantations which said that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. That was, in effect, the credo that was animating a lot of what was happening at the NGO Festival of Hate.
Why was Durban such a wake-up call for the global Jewish community? After all, the Zionism racism resolution had been adopted at the UN in the mid-1970s, was rescinded in 1991, but still it was out there. How and why does Durban set itself apart, and why is it relevant after all these years? What was it that unleashed much of the contemporary anti-Semitism that we're experiencing today?
Well, as you mentioned, Durban was the tipping point for the old, new, globalizing, virulent, lethal, and I would even say sophisticated anti-Semitism. By sophisticated anti-Semitism, I mean the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. And that's what Durban represented, because it was the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism, the laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of human rights, the laundering of anti-Semitism under the struggle against apartheid. So what you had at Durban, therefore, was the legitimation, if you will, of anti-Semitism. And you had both the convergence of states engaged, preceded by the Tehran Regional Conference, which already sounded the alarm with the exclusion of Israel and the exclusion of Jewish NGOs, itself a form of apartheid in the run-up conference to Durban. And you had the NGO gathering. You had, as I said, the convergence of the two, and you had the trigger of those dynamics. I also remember, and it's embedded in my psyche as well, that I flew back from Durban to Montreal and flew back just on the eve of 9/11. And as someone, one of my colleagues put it at the time, if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durban was the Mein Kampf. Durban became the blueprint, the tipping point for the old new anti-Semitism.
Your current position with the Canadian government, which was created over the past year or so, is Special Envoy to preserve Holocaust remembrance and combat anti-Semitism. This is a uniquely broad portfolio for this type of role, of which there are just a few in the world. Often the focus is on anti-Semitism alone or on Holocaust issues alone. Why did the Government of Canada decide to merge these, and how do you see the interplay between both sides of your role?
Well, I think the Government of Canada understood and was very much a part of the adoption of the Stockholm Declaration. We are now approaching the 21st anniversary, but we will be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration in Malmo in October. It was postponed from a year ago. But the Stockholm Declaration itself spoke of the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust. In other words, the Holocaust as a paradigm of radical evil. It also spoke of the evil of anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hate. So you see the interrelationship between the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And in fact, you know, if we look at Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, it is metaphor and message of the interrelationship of the two. We sometimes forget 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. And it remains today the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil, as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And that, I believe, you know, underpinned not only the interrelationship in my mandate, but the Government of Canada convening and becoming the first country in the world to do so, a national urgent summit a month ago with respect to the combating of anti-Semitism, both domestically and internationally. The summit was led by the Prime Minister of Canada. It had the participation of 10 government ministers engaged in developing a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, leaders of civil society, and a broad cross-section of the Jewish community who shared their lived experiences with anti-Semitism today. And I might add that I think the Prime Minister and the ministers and the governor were particularly moved by two sets of testimonies. The testimonies of students who described how they were being bullied and marginalized and indeed excluded from the campus culture, forced to choose between their Jewish identity and acceptance, if you will, in the social justice movements on the campus, in the progressive campus culture, and Black Jewish women who embodied intersectionality as Blacks, as women, and as Jews, and who described themselves as being discriminatory targets of each of their characterizations of intersectionality, but how anti-Semitism, in fact, was the worst. And so after hearing those testimonies, the Prime Minister, who had given opening words to the conference, responded at that point and said to all those present in the summit, said, I just want to say that combating the 3Ds, as he put it, the delegitimization, demonization, double standards. He attributed those 3Ds to me, as I said to him, they were to be attributed to Sharansky. This would be a priority for the government. And the government will make a priority the combating of BDS and the combating of anti-Semitism, both domestically and internationally. And the conference resonated also with the ministers being very supportive of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. And I might add, I shared a 10-point action plan at the summit, which was engaged with by the government as well.
Well, it sounds like it's a template for other countries, and we hope that that they follow in your path. I want to go back to Durban for a second, Irwin. Unlike Durban of 2001 and the Durban Review Conference in Geneva in 2009, which were full conferences, Durban 3 and Durban 4 are similar in that they were one-day events and are one-day events at the General Assembly. Do you feel that these Durban commemorations are downgrades from the 2001 and 2009 iterations, or that inherent in this is tacit acknowledgement by the UN that the Durban process has become problematic? On the other hand, which global actors are determined to keep Durban alive, with some success, it seems?
Well, I think that we should in no way be commemorating Durban, because in doing so, we have to effectively commemorate the legacy. And the legacy was, as I said, a legacy of hate and exclusion, and the singling out of one member state and one people for selective opprobrium and indictment, a standing violation of the UN Charter itself, a standing violation of its foundational principle of equality for all nations, large and small. That is why we have called for countries not to go to the Durban 4, but even more so, we've also called on the United Nations not to hold this conference, because the holding of the conference itself is evocative of that Durban legacy. And unless it is condemnatory of that legacy, and the previous conferences were not, what we're going to be seeing is, in effect, a visitation of that legacy. We should remember that, for example, on the 10th anniversary of the Durban conference in 2011, we had the resuscitation of myths that the Jews were responsible for 9/11. And so you had the convergence of what I referred to before. If 9/11 was a transformative event with respect to the struggle against terrorism, then Durban was a transformative event with respect to the struggle against anti-Semitism. Each had their own legacy of terrorism on the one hand, and the legacy of anti-Semitism and hate on the other. We should not be giving any credence to this. And I would hope that the UN would either cancel this conference or use this conference as a reminder of the ugly legacy of hate and anti-Semitism and be condemnatory of it. But I don't believe that that will happen. And that's why I say we should seek to get more countries not to attend that conference, and indeed to have the UN cancel it. That would be the most effective commemoration and repudiation of that legacy of hate and anti-Semitism.
Well, of course, Canada has announced its non-participation, but the list is a short list, and we're not that far out from the conference that's coming up in September. So we certainly hope that there will be additional countries, at least in the next few weeks, that will add their names to that list, along with Canada, the United States, and others. Finally,
let me just say,
sure.
Very quickly, then, that as part of the national action plan that I issued at the summit, I called on other governments to hold national summits, as Canada did, to combat anti-Semitism. That would itself also be a repudiation of Durban, and also to prepare for Malmo the conference to commemorate the Stockholm Declaration. Each of the member countries attending that is supposed to prepare a set of pledges. And part of those pledges should include the repudiation of that Durban legacy when Malmo convenes in October 2021.
Well, finally, you've been a stalwart voice for human rights and against all forms of racism. What steps would you say could be taken to make clear the stark differences between the fight against racism and issues related to political or territorial conflicts in the Middle East? Because oftentimes they're conflated.
Well, I think what we need to do is, and very quickly in a set of one-liners, number one, and you reference this, we need to mandate the teaching of the Holocaust, education of the Holocaust and education about anti-Semitism, and begin this early in even elementary schools and certainly mandated for high schools. Number two, we need, and for the reasons that I mentioned, number two, we need to invoke and implement also the important parliamentary antecedents and principles with respect to the combating of anti-Semitism. I'm referring to the London Declaration to combat anti-Semitism, the Ottawa Parliamentary Protocol to combat anti-Semitism, both of which framed the very metrics that ultimately became the working definition, the IRA working definition to combat anti-Semitism. And this brings me to this next point. We need to enhance not only the adoption, but the implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It's not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition that we have, but it is the most representative. It was democratically adopted over a 15-year period by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, academics, and the like. We need to institutionalize that in our advocacy with respect to combating anti-Semitism, because if you can't define it as it said, you can't combat it. Number four, we had the largest rise in hate crimes in the year 2020, but by May 2021, we had already reached the same level in 2021 that all of 2020. So we need to develop a formula for the combating of anti-Semitic hate crimes, what I refer to as the 4 Ps: prevention, persecution of the perpetrators, protection of the targets, and partnership between federal, provincial, municipal governments. And we have to combat no less, if not more, the incendiary hate speech on the social media. That has become one of the greatest threats that we have. None of these things take you into the territorial nature of the conflict. In fact, they're distinguishable from it, unless there are those who want to take the conflict and turn it into one of demonological anti-Semitism, where Israel is referred to at one and the same time as a settler, colonial, racist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. When you do that, you're not involved in any legitimate discussions about security issues, territorial issues, etc. And I speak also as well as a person who's been a long-time advocate of 2 states for 2 peoples, but not when you have, as I say, the singling out in a demonizing way, utilizing all the metaphors and messages of demonological anti-Semitism. That is of a different character and scope. And we need to ensure as well, now close on this, to combat the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the very struggle against racism itself. That has to be also a priority in both our domestic and international policies.
Well, Professor Irwin Cotler, that's all the time we have, but thank you for taking the time to be with us to discuss this most important subject for all of us. And thank you all for tuning in. Please stay tuned to our full Durban Revisited series on JBS. And for ways to get engaged, please visit b'naibrith.org or our social media channels. I'm Dan Mariaschin. Goodbye for now.